everyone, welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. We will be talking about the en masse resignation of Muslim ministers in Sri Lanka, along with two governors who've also stepped down from East and Western province. This comes a month after the April 21st Easter bombings that killed over 250 people and injured more than 400 others in terror attacks across the island nation. Let me first introduce our panel of guests. We have with us Ms. Chathuri Dissanayake from Sri Lanka. She's a journalist and she'll be updating us on the situation on the ground. Also, we have with us Mr. Easwaran Rutnam, analyst from Colombo. Ms. Chathuri, let me start with you. Were these resignations in sole protest against the government for not being able to protect the Muslim community, or were there other reasons?
The resignations, as I understand it, was in solidarity with one minister whose resignation was demanded by a monk who was fasting, who had launched a fast unto death from Friday. So it was only Minister Rishad Badruddin, a powerful government minister, whose resignation was demanded, but all the other Muslim ministers also resigned in solidarity with Mr. Rishad Badruddin. And
right. But could you tell us why his resignation was demanded in the first place?
So according to what this Chathuri Dissanayake, the monk who sat down for a fast unto death on Friday, this minister is alleged to have had connections with the Easter Sunday bombers, and according to him, he claims that this minister is connected and has aided the terrorist group.
Are these vague allegations, or is there any kind of categorical connection he has stated?
No, he hasn't given definitive reasons why he's giving these allegations, nor has any allegations or complaints been proven against this minister by any of the investigating authorities of the government. So these are just allegations made up brought out by this monk and a few other hardline Buddhist monks.
And it's not, when you say there are more supporting this cause, there's also the Archbishop of Sri Lanka who is also supporting these monks who are protesting against the Muslim community and essentially those representing them in the government.
Yes, correct. Yesterday, before the monk called off his hunger strike, the Archbishop of Colombo, Cardinal Malcolm Ranjit, visited this monk who was fasting and called on the government to investigate into indirect connections some of these members are alleged to have to the terrorist group.
He's been accused of having abetted and aided these terrorist attacks, correct?
Yes, correct.
Right, and this
I have to say that none of these allegations have been proven by any of the investigating bodies so far.
And the investigation has not concluded over this connection, right? And so is it the ministers who have also resigned in solidarity, is it safe to say that it is essentially to help this investigation so that it is not biased?
Yes, they have said so. They have stated immediately after they handed over their resignation, they had a briefing, and there they gave a statement saying that all of these Muslim leaders are resigning from their current portfolios so that there would be space for an impartial investigation, and there would not be any possibility of influencing the investigating teams in their work.
Right. So they're being very cooperative at this point, giving up their posts from the government. Is there a possibility that their resignations have been accepted and that they will not be reinstated irrespective of if they're not proven guilty?
They've given a month. They've said that the Criminal Investigation Department would be able to carry out all the investigations within a month. and they're still within the government. They're still supporting the government, and they were very clear on that yesterday also. So I don't think there would be an issue in terms of reinstating them, because the government does need these ministers' support to carry on, to hold majority in parliament. So it would be very interesting to see how this investigation also pans out.
So hypothetically, if the investigation doesn't pan out in the favor of these Muslim ministers, what would happen to Parliament? Who in the opposition would take the lead then?
The thing is, they're still supporting the government. So the government still has majority in Parliament in that case. So unless they actually step down from their MP post as well, as members of Parliament as well, there won't be an issue there. So even if they do step down from the government, from their MP post, then the next person in the same party will hold that post.
Okay. So let me bring in our second guest into this conversation. What a snapshot of how this has transpired. Mr. Easwaran, do you feel that the protest, it was not a protest, this resignation against the government for not having done much for the Muslim community? Did that at all play a significant role in these resignations?
Well, I think more than what the government has done or not done for the Muslims, the issue here is about one particular minister, as Chathuri was mentioning, Rishad Badruddin, and there's been a lot of calls for him to step down, and I think he was not prepared to step down because that would make it look like he is guilty. So I think what has happened is all the Muslim ministers and parliamentarians have come together and shown solidarity to this minister, and they have resigned in solidarity. And of course, I guess they are not mentioning that openly, but they said that they want investigations to take place independently and fairly, and also ensure that the government protects the Muslims at the same time. But the issue here surrounds this one particular person. And it's a case of all Muslim ministers joining hands and supporting him, and of course ensuring that this allegation against.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Easwaran. Ms. Chathuri, let me quickly ask you before we head forward. What kind of situation is unfolding right now in Sri Lanka in terms of how the masses are reacting to this resignation? Could you sketch a picture for us of the protests that are taking place and the communal violence that's on the rise there?
So yesterday there were signs of violence during around noon before the resignations of the ministers in several parts. Now, the monk who was released recently, Galagodatta Atte Nyanasara monk, also led in some of these protests demanding the resignation. Now it seems to have died down since then, since the resignations, and it is a lot calmer now. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So you think the situation has calmed down in Sri Lanka now after the resignations? Thank you much, Ms. Chathuri, for letting us know what is happening right now. Let me welcome another guest who's just joining us, Mr. Hilmy Ahamed, the Vice President of the Muslim Council of Sri Lanka, joining us from Colombo. Mr. Hilmy, I would like to get your point of view here on these resignations that have taken place. There is a debate going on whether they were in protest to the government, that not much is being done to protect the Muslim community, or was it essentially to help in this investigation against one of the ministers who has resigned?
Yes, it was indeed a protest, for the government's failure to maintain law and order, and the continued attacks on the Muslims by extremist groups.
It was essentially a protest, and it had nothing to do with aiding this investigation that is against one of the ministers.
No, this is all cooked up charges against the minister.
Then why would they resign? Don't they essentially put into jeopardy the alliance that they have and give power into the opposition's hand?
Yes, no, they are not sitting in the opposition camp. They are sitting with the government.
No,
right,
I'm
for
sorry. You
sitting as
misunderstood the question. I'm
backbenchers.
saying, why would they have to resign over an allegation if these are cooked up charges? Don't they essentially hand over the power to the opposition if they are resigning?
No, but they are not resigning from being with the government. They have resigned their portfolios and asked the government to investigate if they have any allegations. But this is also a protest to show that, the Muslims have been affected by these extremist groups and that the government should take action. But they will not allow the government to fall.
They won't allow the government to fall. Could you talk a little about what kind of a political motivation would these monks have to stage these charges, these alleged trumped-up charges against these ministers?
No, the main reason I believe is that in October 18 there was an attempted constitutional coup, and the Muslims stood by the current government, and that the opposition could not take over the reins of power. So since then, these Muslim ministers have been targeted, and this was an opportunity for the opposition to press charges claiming that they are involved with terrorist activities, which they are not, in my understanding.
Okay, right. Stay with us there. Let me introduce Mr. Ali Shabry, a civil activist joining us from Colombo. Mr. Ali, if you could talk a little about what is happening across the board with the Muslims there. There has been a lot of communal violence since the April Easter bombing attacks. How are the Muslims now positioned after the ministers resigning?
I don't know, but definitely that's a sacrifice on the part of the Muslim ministers. If not for the resigning, there was an agitation all over the country. It was turning into a very ugly situation, and some of the monks have.
Do you think, Mr. Ali, do you think the resignations are going to help bring down the violence or the marginalization of Muslims in the community? At immediate aftermath, yes, I think it helped to quell the threat of violence which has been going on. Some of the monks have been giving deadlines, and day before yesterday, a monk who was recently pardoned by the president had threatened, unless this take place yesterday at some point in time, in his own language, threatening that there could be violence or carnivals all over the country. So that's the word he used in Sinhalese. So I think immediately that would have helped to quell the threat of a violence. But then going forward, we need to sit back and analyze as to how it's going to. Right, but the condemnation, let me read out a couple of statements that came from senior politicians expressing outrage over the nature of these demands that are coming up. The Minister of Finance said, a shameful day for our beloved Sri Lanka. Then also a senior lawmaker from the Tamil Alliance, he said, unfortunate that Muslim ministers succumbed to pressure from racists. And also suggesting that today it's us, tomorrow it's going to be another other. So the question, Mr. Hilmy, is really, do you see this being as maybe counterproductive for the cause of Muslims there, considering the kind of Islamophobic atmosphere taking rise in Sri Lanka?
Yeah, actually, it has been rise ever since the attack. It has been very well organized. Muslims have been marginalized in so many areas, including in their trade, businesses, and their mosque and the property and all those things. So I think something had to be done just to bring it down for the moment until explanations take place. Now, so in that sense, I personally believe that that was a good decision to make at that point in time, and from thereafter. Now, what they say, the ministers, if you have any allegations against us, inquire into it and proceed with it, and either if there is anybody guilty, find them guilty, or otherwise just clear it and move on, rather than we can be embroiled in this, because generally in Sri Lanka, Muslims are a very peaceful community. We have never been involved in any sorts of violence whatsoever. We cannot be held accountable for 21 terrorists, what they have done, and a gang of extremists. I think if the government and the majority is sensible, they must take the majority of the Muslim community into their confidence to defeat the extremism together. So, in that kind of light, I think it was very.
But do you think the Muslim community is doing anything about these allegations and this what has happened in the past in terms of the communal sort of violence against them, the marginalization? Does the leadership have a concrete plan?
I don't know. I unfortunately, I don't think that we have been. I mean, other than civil society and the leaders on their own had been doing a few here and there. But now this is a good opportunity for everybody to come together and have a common stand and find a way out of this. Because we are a peaceful community, we don't want any marginalization. In the meantime, we also don't want anything extra other than the normal people in this country.
All right, thank you so much. Very quick, last 10 seconds left. I want to get this question in from you, Mr. Ali. If you could comment on, do you feel that maybe the current situation in Sri Lanka has anything to do with external factors or actors in the region who might have interfered and caused the upheaval there?
I believe that some people probably, I don't know whether they were directly involved in this, but given the situation, probably people with an external links and ulterior motives would like to come and stay in Sri Lanka and take advantage of the situation and geopolitics, if that is how it played out.
Right. Okay, my last question to you, Mr. Hilmy, do you think that maybe external factors might have anything to do with the situation as it is unfolding in Sri Lanka?
The information that we have, especially from intelligence sources, that there has been no major external involvement other than low-level contacts with ISIS by some of the suicide squads. But I mean, there is still investigations going on, and until and unless they complete it, right, we wouldn't know. But our initial suspicion was that there was major external involvement. But, the intelligence agencies seems to dispel that myth.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Hilmy and Mr. Ali, for your time and your input there on this developing story. We'll take a quick short break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. Now we will be discussing US President Donald Trump's visit to UK, which is going to be just across 3 days. Now, the idea was to boost trade links in a post-Brexit world and reaffirm security cooperation ahead of the 75th anniversary of the Allies' D-Day landings in World War II. However, once again, with his mercurial Twitter statements, President Trump has already caused quite a stir in the UK, deriding London Mayor Sajid Khan and also criticizing Theresa May. Now, the transatlantic alliance between the two has been the main topic of discussion here, and analysts are commenting left, right, and center how it might just be on a trend towards the downside. But before we get into details, let me introduce our guests who are joining us. We have Professor Tim Benton. He's the Dean of Strategic Research Initiatives at the University of Leeds in the UK. Also, we have with us Mr. Zeno Leoni, Teaching Fellow in Challenges to the International Order Defence Studies Department in King's College, London. But first, let's get an update on the situation there in London from our correspondent, Mr. Olly Barratt. Olly, what can you tell us about the situation right now where you are?
Well, I'm in Trafalgar Square in central London, where protesters are gathering for a Stop Trump protest here in London. So you can see some are here already, are preparing for the events of the day. We have a few hundred people on site at the moment, but organisers are saying they do believe thousands of people are going to attend protests here in London. and elsewhere in the UK, in other cities as well. All of this unfolding as Donald Trump continues that state visit to Britain. He's been meeting with business leaders this morning, along with figures from the UK government. There are also more formal talks to come later with the UK Prime Minister Theresa May. Those discussions will be focusing on issues around trade. We can expect them, though, to also discuss issues around Huawei, the Chinese telecoms firm that the Americans are very worried about, indeed, in terms of national security concerns. We'll expect the two leaders to discuss Brexit as well. And then later on this afternoon, London time, we will get a press conference from Theresa May, the British Prime Minister, and Donald Trump, the US President. And I suppose that is when we might expect some sparks to fly, because Donald Trump is not known to hold back when he is asked questions by journalists. Those journalists will be wanting to ask him about Brexit, about the Conservative Party leadership contest underway here in the UK as well. Will he intervene in UK politics and pick some runners and riders in the Conservative Party leadership race?
And also, you mentioned that thousands are expected to show up in these protests. There must be a lot of security arrangements taking place, considering he is there, the US president, and these protests might come in the way of his agenda there in London.
Yeah, a lot of protesters are angry at Donald Trump's presence in the UK. They're angry also at the fact that he is being honoured with a full state visit, which is not necessarily rolled out to all international leaders, even all US presidents. It is a modern phenomenon, this idea of American presidents getting a state visit. And many of the protesters here believe that Donald Trump should not have been offered one so quickly by Prime Minister Theresa May when she became the British leader. Many of the protesters here are talking about their anger over things like what they say is Donald Trump's misogyny, his racism, his positions on immigration, on trade as well. Others, though, here in the UK are saying this is an American president, the leader of one of our strongest allies, and he should be treated with the respect that the office of US president deserves. So there are mixed feelings here, but there will be thousands of people we expect out on the streets of London and other British cities later on to make their feelings known. That will include, by the way, some members of the political establishment. Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the opposition Labour Party, will be taking part, will be addressing the rally here in London, we expect, later on. So, as I say, some members of the political establishment adding their views to those of protesters who are gathering behind me here in Trafalgar Square.
Also, yesterday's reception by the Queen, how was it received across the board, not just with members of Parliament, but also the public? What is the sense that you're gathering from the streets and speaking to others?
Yeah, I think the sense is that the state banquet went pretty smoothly, about as smoothly as could be expected. Donald Trump gave a shorter speech than many were expecting. It was pretty bland, according to many analysts' views of it. It was not controversial. He talked about the relations between the United Kingdom and the United States. He praised the Queen herself as she sat beside him. He did not go off script. There was nothing off the cuff that could have got him into hot water in terms of his comments. The Queen also praising long-standing ties between the UK and the United States. She also did mention the way that the US and Britain worked, notably after and around the period of the two world wars, on international institutions. And certainly the government here in the UK is minded to remind Donald Trump of the way that the Americans and the British have worked on these international institutions over the years. He, of course, has been pretty critical of some of those international bodies, like the United Nations, like the NATO military alliance as well. So perhaps some gentle reminders from the British with the US president in town that the British believe that some of these alliances and international bodies and organizations can be used for good rather than be knocked down by the US president.
Right. And the US president also has 1 day left now in the UK. What are the plans for the remaining of his trip?
Yeah, so we will have that press conference later this afternoon. Donald Trump will be hosted at a dinner at the residence of the American ambassador in London later this evening. We will see again representatives of the British royal family attending that event. On Wednesday, he travels to Portsmouth in the south of England for commemorations around the anniversary of the D-Day landings during the Second World War. That is a big part of his trip to Europe. He's then heading off to France later in the week for more D-Day events.
Okay, very quickly, last question, Mr. Olly. Any specific member of the royalty or the government who did not attend the state dinner yesterday in a manner of protest or trying to make a point?
Well, we did. Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the opposition Labour Party, he boycotted that state banquet, and he's been criticised in some quarters for doing so because he has attended several state banquets before with leaders of other countries who also have questionable records on issues like human rights, for example, but no significant boycotts from members of the royal family, no, although Meghan Markle, the wife of Prince Harry, has not been meeting US President Donald Trump while he is in town. They have traded some comments about each other in the past, but it's being described that she is on maternity leave, and that's why she's not taking part in Donald Trump's visit here.
All right, thank you so much, Olly Barratt there, our correspondent in London. Thank you so much. Coming back to you, Professor Tim Benton, let's start. We're trying to hash out what is happening there in the UK. A huge number of people out on the streets and preparing for a really big protest. It seems in the numbers to be somewhere around the thousands. What do you make of this reaction of the British public?
Well, I think Olly got it pretty right, really, that there is a lot of discordance between the British public's values and those espoused by President Trump, particularly around issues to do with some of his attitudes to racism, the economic impact through his trade disputes with China, the way that he interferes or he comments on UK politicians and so on. And I think there is this issue that we should respect him as embodying the United States of America and our long-term ally, but his attitude to being imposed and the way he does it does create a lot of personal anger from many of our citizens.
All right. And Mr. Zeno, what's your take on the kind of reaction the US president has invoked, considering the tweets that he sent out right before landing in the UK, where he derided the mayor of London, calling him with quite negative terminology?
I think we can give two interpretations to this. On the one hand, we find two politicians with very different styles and personalities, so Sadiq Khan and Trump, and then might be just about personal antipathy. But on the other hand, I think these two politicians, they represent two very different worldviews. So on the one hand, we got the mayor of the capital of, or one of the capital of global business, representing a globalist worldview, also the views of global finance. And on the other hand, we got a very nationalist president. Of course, every American president is nationalist, but as we have found out so far, Trump is giving a very, very nationalist interpretation to American grand strategy. And what we also see is that London confirmed itself as a state city, as a city where politics can transcend the national borders of the British state.
Okay, so Professor Tim, what kind of discussions are on the table, and is something serious going to come out after a meeting with Theresa May in Downing Street?
In reality, Theresa May, the current Prime Minister, is stepping down after Donald Trump's visit. So the degree to which that they can advance any particular agendas is really up in the air. But clearly one of the things that in a post-Brexit world we are concerned about is the potential of a trade deal with the United States. So I'm sure there'll be some discussions about the shape of that. And equally, there is a lot of national anger amongst our citizens around Donald Trump's attitude to climate change. And the climate change community in the United Kingdom have sent a big letter to Theresa May to say, please raise with Donald Trump the fact that there is a climate emergency, and unless things are done, we will face a societal existential crisis in decades to come. So how that will play out in the discussions and whether either of them mention it at the press conference this afternoon, we are waiting to see.
And Mr. Zeno, the climate change issue is a big one, especially since Trump was the one who led the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement in 2017. What do you think will come out of that? Is there going to be any kind of pressure on the US to see eye to eye with what the general European stance has been on climate change?
I'm afraid I have to admit that I don't think this will be a key issue on the agenda, particularly since the UK is about probably to leave the EU. So I feel like Trump in that regard at this particular moment has less pressure, while I'm more concerned with the fact that Trump is trying to reach a trade deal, is trying to push the UK out of the EU and trying to sell a bad trade deal to the UK, which will probably involve selling pharmaceutical and other kind of health products and technologies and agricultural products to the United Kingdom. So I think that will be probably the key issue in talks later on this week.
Also, Professor Tim, one of the major issues discussed as expected to be ironed out in the next day or so is the Chinese telecom giant Huawei's making a network, 5G network in the UK. This is something that President Trump has been protesting against. What do you make of this development? Is this going to, in turn, put a lot of pressure on the UK to make a decision on how they deal with China?
I'm pretty sure that Donald Trump will try and put a lot of pressure on Britain. And it's quite interesting to see the way that the populist government of Trump is trying to extend its sphere of influence and, in the terminology of somebody I was reading the other day, bully Europe and other nation states into accepting their way of viewing things. And certainly within the UK government, there was some degree of discord already within the cabinet about the role of Huawei in rolling out our 5G phone network. And with Mrs. May being gone, perhaps that means that we will become more susceptible to the United States' view on this, although clearly it depends on who the next prime minister is going to be. And Donald Trump has already made somewhat undiplomatic comments about who he thinks the next leader will be, which is not really the way that we would have expected presidents in the past to have behaved. And if it is somebody who is a close ally of Donald Trump, then we can expect, I think, to be much more within their sphere of influence.
Now, Mr. Zeno, is an interesting point that Professor Benton has just highlighted here. President Trump has once again deferred from what diplomatic protocol calls for. He has shown his favorite for the next leader for the UK. First of all, could you talk a little about his preferred candidate here and how that will play out for the candidate, considering all those protesters on the streets today are essentially against everything that Trump has stood for, not for the US, but generally for the region?
Yes, so with regard to the first question, I think I will go back to my point where nowadays national events clearly are transcending the national borders of states, and British issues are becoming transnational issues, and British leaders and American leaders campaign internationally for their own domestic issue. And clearly Trump is trying to push forward the agenda of the international right, of the international white supremacists. And that's why that has triggered such a harsh reaction from Sadiq Khan. And not surprisingly, British people are in the street protesting against that.
Right. Now you talk about the Mayor of London, Mr. Sadiq Khan. Let's also show our viewers what he said in response to President Trump's statements on Twitter.
President Trump, if you're watching this, your values and what you stand for are the complete opposite of London's values and the values in this country. We think diversity is not a weakness, diversity is a strength. We respect women and we think they're equal to men. We think it's important to safeguard the rights of all of us, particularly the vulnerable and the marginalised. When you are the President of the USA, you have a massive leadership role. You have a massive platform as well. People follow what you do. What we've seen over the last few years in the USA is a rolling back of much of the progress made in previous decades. It's really important we continue to move forwards. What we're seeing in the USA is a rolling back of the reproductive rights of women. We've got a situation now where some states in the USA are making it almost impossible for women to have the rights to have an abortion. One only has to look at the history books to realise the consequences of women not having the right to choose over their own body. What we can't afford to do is return to backstreet abortions. What we can't afford to see is a return to the situation in decades where you had women have no control over their bodies. It's really important we support women in the USA. The fight for gender equality shouldn't just be a fight for women and girls. All of us should be feminists, and that means men and boys too. It was Malala Yousafzai, the Nobel Prize winner, who said, how can all of us benefit when half of us are held back? That's why it's all our interest to be feminists. If you believe that it's wrong that there's gender inequality, if you believe it's wrong that women are less than men, if you believe it's wrong that women are still discriminated against in 2019, then you're a feminist.
You heard there the Mayor of London, Mr. Sadiq Khan, addressing Trump. A lot of key issues he's brought up, Professor Benton, here that Britishers are, of course, they hold very close to their heart. And one of the responses this invoked was from the New York Mayor, Bill de Blasio, who actually President Trump compared Mr. Khan to as very dumb and incompetent. He even turned out and responded that this is beyond the bail for even our country's leader to make this kind of a personal attack. Now, Mr. Benton, of course, President Trump is known for making these wild statements every now and then, irrespective of who he's talking about. But doesn't this kind of create a stir in the UK, how those who are looking to see their next leader step in, the next prime minister step in, who will they be standing behind, especially as somebody who supports Trump, do you think?
Well, that's a really complicated question, because the dynamic, the way that the Conservative Party is fighting over the next leader is not the same as the dynamics of Parliament, and whoever comes in, whether it's a friend of Trump or an enemy of Trump, the potential for leading a Trump-like view of Brexit is not likely to hold a parliamentary majority, I don't think. But the point that you're making around presidential behavior, I think, is a really deep-seated one, because with the whole kind of post-truth, post-fact, agenda that Trump pushes, there is a rejection of rationalism which has guided the development of our kind of intellectual thought for centuries. And it really is shocking on a kind of day-by-day basis that whether it is in some of the things that are spilling over to this side of the Atlantic from Trump's attitudes, whether it is Brexit or whether it is Trump himself, that actually we're not being able to trust our politicians to tell the truth anymore. And I think this is creating a real underlying problem for democracy. If we cannot trust our politicians to tell the truth, how do we actually manage to make the right decisions?
Right, how do you manage to take the... And Mr. Zeno, what's your reaction to this video, this response by London's mayor?
Yeah, I think, well, I don't agree with everything with regard to London mayor's worldviews and idea, but with regard to this video, he made absolutely necessary, legitimate and crucial claims, requests, and it's unacceptable nowadays that anybody who would side or would agree with Donald Trump's views when it comes to human rights or female rights. On the other hand, we can, of course, discuss about Donald Trump's critique of global finance, globalization, but we should always be able to separate the two issues, okay?
Right. Okay, so very quickly also, Professor Benton, the relationship of the US and UK, some analysts say, has been compromised over UK's fixation over the Brexit. They've been focused on it for the past year and more. Do you believe that this might have affected the transatlantic alliance?
Yes and no. I mean, we are very, very close to the United States in our general sort of attitudes and the way that we think about things. President Trump is just the current leader, so there is lots of underlying issues that means that we should be close. But I think the UK has a low credibility, particularly following the last 3 years of debate around Brexit and how we will be as an independent actor if we do leave the European Union. The value of the United States to us is a little bit uncertain at the moment, I think.
Okay, and Mr. Zeno, do you think this relationship, if is on the rocks, as it is being said, could it improve if the Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson succeeds in replacing Theresa May?
Okay, I think ultimately international relations often comes down to what the bureaucrats in their respective states want, and those bureaucrats are those who will provide continuity. Said that, should we have Boris Johnson as a prime minister, I think we will have a Brexit. We will have a very close relationship with the United States, and I think the plan there from the United States, at least Trump's plan, is to try to fragment, undermine a European Union increasingly led by Germany, and by Germany's mercantilist policies that the US cannot contrast anymore. Right. So I think we will have, should Boris Johnson be elected, we will have a very positive, very close relationship.
Okay, and let's talk a little about the sort of tariffs, the actual tariffs benefits that the US and UK are eager to converse about, to make a deal over. What are the real significant free trade benefits for the UK from the US? Professor Bennett, if I could get your comments on this.
That's a difficult one, because on the one hand, you have the potential for us adopting agricultural biotechnology and importing food that is produced under different sets of rules in the United States. That might make things cheaper in the UK, but there is quite a big backlash from people about the standards that food is grown under in the United States, and having to adopt genetic technologies that are used in the United States will jar with many people. As Zeno said earlier, there is going to be likely a move to undermine our health service and privatize that in the name of the United States. And so whether or not the potential for a free trade agreement, whether or not we actually can stand firm in our beliefs and our desires for our people, as opposed to just making things cheap and freely flowing, which is certainly some of the rhetoric that is used by our trade secretary. I don't know, and I think there is quite a lot of public debate that we'll need to have before the shape of a trade deal gets worked out.
Right, but Mr. Zeno, let me ask you this. Duties, of course, that are already quite low as 3% on average, though EU might set substantially higher ones. How does it benefit them significantly? Because a lot of the focus is on this trade, especially now that Brexit is imminent and that the UK will be relying more on the US for its income.
Okay, you might be right, but I think we shouldn't only focus on the quantitative aspect of this trade, but also on its qualitative aspect. And I think undermining, should we have American technology, American products, bought by the NHS, that might be part of a broader project, of a broader plan to lead to a degree of to trigger a degree of privatization within the British health system. So I'm more concerned about long-term implication eventually, rather than tariffs.
Okay, all right. Well, we're running out of time. I just want a last question in, Professor Benton, from you about an overall picture that you can see evolving from the President Trump's visit to the UK. What do you see happening in the near future?
Well, I'm very pleased that last night the Queen made such a strong pitch about protecting the international architecture of cooperation, the UN and the WTO and so on. Quite how this will play out really does depend on the volatility of our domestic politics around Brexit, and who knows who will be Prime Minister and whether or not we will have a general over the next month or two. Because on the one hand, we could have a very strong trade relationship with the United States and be isolated from Europe. On the other hand, there is still a chance that we don't leave Europe or have a second referendum, in which case the Trump trade deal might fall by the wayside. So there's everything to play for.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor Benton there, and Mr. Zeno, for your wonderful insight. We've come to the end of the program. With that, we are going to see you next week. Till then, goodbye.